thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for coming to part of the old growth celebration that they're having at the library. I hope you're able to take part in a lot of the other parts of this celebration out here on the 4th floor. If you haven't noticed yet, Eric Jensen over here has a fantastic art show. It's really nice, so please do take a look at it if you haven't yet. There's a couple more really cool talks coming up. Rick Bass, if you don't know him, an amazing author. And then Joan Maloof, who is the founder of the Old Growth Network. And so those are coming up. I'll go ahead and jump into tonight's talk. And I'm going to talk about old growth forests, the libraries of tree and ecosystem knowledge. And believe it or not, I've used this sort of analogy of libraries before when it comes to old growth and old trees. It's just that I actually get to talk about it in a library this time, which is kind of interesting. And so I hope as I go along, you'll get a feeling for why I think that libraries are a really good way of looking at some of these old trees. So I'll go ahead and get started. So old growth forests, what are they? Believe it or not, there's no single definition for what an old growth forest is. And there's lots of good reasons for that. Forests are just too varied. Trees are just too different in the kind of trajectories that they have for us to pin any one sort of a definition on them. If you think about aspen, if you go into some of the oldest aspen groves that are out there, they're going to be maybe pushing 60 years old. There might be some older ones. And then if you look at a sequoia or even a whitebark pine, there's a pretty big difference in age and, all the kinds of things that develop in those forests. So it's very hard to put a single definition on. And also, definitions are human perspectives. And so definitions are going to vary by that human perspective. And so if you ask a forester what an old growth forest is, they're probably going to tell you trees of a certain successional stage. They've gone through the young, the middle-aged, and now they're an old established forest. And that age might vary depending on the species. And if you ask an ecologist, they're going to say a lot of the same things, but it's going to be a forest with very low disturbance, okay? And that is what has allowed them to actually reach these very old ages, is they haven't been burnt down, they haven't been killed by beetles, they haven't been knocked down by a hurricane. So there's lots of different definitions. And for many, I think people think of old growth as virgin forests, things that haven't been cut, that haven't been influenced much by humans. And that's partly true, but there's a lot of virgin forests out there that are not old growth. They've been through a lot of natural disturbance. So it just depends. So a lot of people will ask, how much is left of old growth? And as you can imagine, if you can't define something very well, it's certainly hard to put a percentage of what that is and what's left, right, if you can't even define it. So I guess a way to look at it is, in the US, at least 90% of our forests have already been cut at least once. A few of those that were cut long ago might have reverted back to somewhat of a old growth structure. But if we think about the 10% that remain that haven't been cut, only a small percent of those are old growth. Because of those, many of them have been affected by fire, hurricanes, beetles, you name it, lots of natural disturbance. So I guess my answer is there's not much. There is not very much left out there. Okay, so why are they important? Okay. And I want to stress this well beyond what I call the museum exhibit stands that we have out there. These small patches where people have found beautiful trees and protected them. You can drive up to them and appreciate them. They usually have a lot of signage that tell you all these amazing facts, right? How tall they are, how old they are, how big around they are. what happened during parts of their lives that we go, oh boy, they're really old. But they're really kind of museum stands. And they're beautiful to see, but there's a lot more to old growth than just big old trees and that kind of beauty. For one, they're crucial for biodiversity, okay? I think a lot of people are under the perception that old growth has more biodiversity than the younger second growth forests around them. That's not necessarily true. In fact, a lot of old growth may have less biodiversity if you just do it in counting species. But it's the species that are there that matter, because most of these are specialists and they can only survive in old growth. And so it's really the only place they can be. A lot of those that are out in the secondary, younger forests are generalists. They can live in a lot of different places, but that's not true for the ones in old growth. So if you start losing the ones that are in old growth, you lose some of our total biodiversity. This second point, I'm pointing at myself, that doesn't work. Right here. I think this is a really important point. Oh, this is going to be fun with two screens. I'll point at one then the other so I don't leave half of you out. But I think this point that it's a place where nature can show us how it would do things is super important. Old growth forests, wilderness, whether it's old growth or not, are some of the last remaining places where we can see how nature would have done it. Without us cutting, without us managing, we have changed things immensely. And in these years where we're having to learn fast how to restore degraded forests, these are places we can go to figure out how nature would have done it. Places we can use as a reference. And these are the few that are left. There are also places of high continuity. So these are places where organisms have interacted over time for very long periods. And what that does is it builds an incredibly unique community that exists nowhere else and only builds with that long time frame. Okay? And then, of course, it's a library of knowledge, and that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. So, what is it about old trees that can make them libraries? Places where knowledge is stored, okay? So I want to talk about that. And I want to start by talking about the importance of elders, not just old trees, but elders and nature in general, as places that store knowledge, okay? As humans, we think of elders as, older people that have been through a lot, have experienced a lot, they're repositories of knowledge. We go to them for wisdom and knowledge. That's been something humans have done for a very long time. But it's not just humans that contain knowledge in their elders, okay? Nature does it as well, okay? And that's what I'm going to try and focus on tonight. And I'm going to start with a story of a fish. And you might be going, I didn't come here to hear about fish. I want to hear about trees. And you will. But I think this fish is a really good place to start. So this fish that you see on either side of me is a North Atlantic cod. Okay? There were millions and millions and millions of these in the Atlantic. And when settlers came, they noticed this. Became the basis of a huge fishing industry. I mean, that's why we have places called things like Cape Cod, and became this huge industry. When the fishermen went out, they targeted these great, big, really old fish. Many of these large cod are 200 years or more old. And that's what was being fished. And that went on for a long time. And then in the 1990s, the fishery collapsed. There's still some out there, but it has collapsed. And there were a lot of speculation as to what happened. And people started thinking about some of these stories that developed over time. And one of them was that these big old cod were really wise. They had been around a long time. And when food ran out, the cod knew where to go, where to migrate to get more food. And so they would migrate to these places they knew, and they would show the little young cod where to go. And then the little young cod would learn where those places were to go. And when they grew up to be a great big cod, they would show the next generations where to go. Okay? And so the idea was they thought that if we lost all these big old cod out there, the little fish didn't know where to go. And that story is pretty cool, but it's not exactly right. But it was pretty close in a way. So scientists started studying these fish, and what they learned was those great big cod were different. They had a gene that made them grow slowly, but into really big fish, and they didn't sexually mature until they were quite old. The little fish grew fast, but they didn't get very big, and they sexually matured at a very young age. Now that didn't actually account for the lack of migration, okay? And what they found is not only by losing those big cod did they lose the genes for making big cod grow like that, but also those big cod had a gene which gave them the propensity to migrate. And so when food ran out, the big cod would move, and the little cod would follow. And the little cod, it turns out, don't have that gene. And so when the big cod were lost, the little cod just stayed in place and they starved to death. And so what happened really was that by losing those big cod, you lost some of the genetics of that species. You lost part of that knowledge that's held up in the genetics, and they basically lost part of the library that they needed in order to survive. And so keeping that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit about genetic diversity, because it really is something we can equate to knowledge. This genetic diversity is where organisms store the knowledge that they need to do everything they need to survive and just even become, who they are, build their tissues. So it's all the knowledge of that species. And it's really interesting, as someone that works on genetics, some of the techniques we use in the lab actually look like libraries. And so what you're looking at up here are genetic profiles. And you can see all those, there it is. It's not getting the wrong side. It's not actually showing. Anyway, you can see all those bands that go across. Each one of those is an individual. And you can see the vertical bands that look like books on a library stack, right? Those are markers that coincide with different genetic areas on the genome of that organism. And each of those areas, or a few together, encode for something that is information that particular organism needs. And so it's very much like a stack of books. And you can see that some of the individuals up and down have the same book. They share the same knowledge. They've read the same book. And then others don't. And some have books that other ones don't have. And so if this was a population of individuals, you can see that individuals have certain knowledge. But then if you take it as a whole, it's like you're seeing the full library that's available to that population, because it's the totality of the whole of what those organisms have, okay? Now that kind of comparison between genetic information and books goes even deeper. So if you look at DNA, it's made up of what we call a language, a code. And so if we move along, the little nucleotides that are on DNA, each of those we give a letter. And certain letters that go together form genes that encode for certain functions. So you can think of them as words. And so we can actually read these codes like a language. And that is the information that is stored in the DNA. And so that whole idea that individuals have their library, and then when you look at the total genetic information for a population or species, you're looking at the entire library. Okay? So what happens when things are removed selectively from populations, such as we saw with the big cod? I didn't have time to draw a new picture, so you're going to have to use your imaginations here. So when I use in a class, so you're going to have to look at the crows as us, and we are picking off big cod, which happen to be, in this case, the green beetles, all right? And so over time, because we have such a preference for those green beetles or the big cod, we eventually remove those. And what we're left with are these yellow beetles or little cod. And so what we've done is we've selected for that population to change, but we've removed part of its library. We've taken away information from that species, okay, that it can no longer use. Okay, so keep that in mind as I go along. Okay, so I've been talking about having genetic diversity, having lots of books, and that if you lose books, you're losing information. So I want to stress how important genetic diversity really is, okay? It's a good way of thinking about it is that it is adaptation's toolkit, okay? If you had this toolkit, it's got 3 tools in it, and if you have a big problem that comes along, what's the likelihood you're going to have a tool that you need? Pretty low, right? But if you have this toolkit, the likelihood if you can't see it very well, this is one of those like 1,200 toolkits you can get online. I can't imagine what the shipping is, but but if you have a toolkit like this, the likelihood you're going to have a tool, maybe 10, is pretty high, okay? And that's how genetic diversity works. When things like the conditions in the environment, climate change, stuff comes along, organisms have to adapt. How do they adapt? They have to have the genetic diversity to do it. If they don't have it, they can't. And so this is adaptation's toolkit. Genetic diversity is pretty crucial. So now she's finally getting away from fish and beetles, and she's going to talk about trees. So I would argue that with some of the stuff that people are finding, that it turns out that not in all forests, but many, these old trees really are repositories or reservoirs of knowledge. Okay. And I'm going to start by working up from single trees into forests. Okay. Now, ecologists would seldom look at a single tree for genetic diversity. Okay, and there's a very good reason. Because a tree has what it's born with. Okay, so you have a seed. That is the result of the genetics of the one parent joining with the genetics of the other parent, and then that tree germinates, and every cell in that tree has that same combination of genes. Okay? That's what it's born with, and that's what it's going to have. So why would we look at an individual tree to see what kind of genetic diversity it has? We know what it has, just that set that it got. Well, there's a grad student in Canada who looked a little further. She looked at these giant, this is not one of them, this is just a placeholder, but these giant, really old spruce in Canada. And she looked at the genetic diversity in that tree, and several of them. So she collected tissues from the roots. She took it from under the bark on different parts of the tree. She took it from the crown in different places, and then did the genetics, sequenced that. And what she found was, yes, the tree had its genome all over the place, as you'd expect, but in different places, it had different diversity. So what was happening, because trees are really old, they're long-lived, they're around for a long time, they go through a lot, they have a lot of time to accumulate mutations. And mutations are like when your cells divide and you're supposed to copy your library perfectly. That doesn't always happen. You know, if you think back to when all our books were transcribed by hand, do you think it was always perfect? I bet there were mistakes all the time. And that happens with our DNA when it's copied. Their mistakes are made. We've got all these things that go in and fix it. There's all these great little things our bodies have evolved to fix problems. But some of them get through. Some are bad, okay? They cause that code to change enough that it's detrimental. That usually is a dead end, it dies, or that tissue. Some are neutral, doesn't cause any real change, so it just stays there. And some are beneficial and maybe good. And these accumulate over time. And when you have a tree that lives 400, 500, 600 years, it's got a lot of time to accumulate. Okay? So she found a lot of evidence of changes that way. She also found that things that get into trees, like virus, bacteria, fungi, some of their DNA codes were being incorporated into the trees. And, you know, so they had areas that had bacterial DNA or viral, you know, so that was different. Now, most of that stuff dies with the tree when the tree dies, because it doesn't get passed on. But occasionally, some of these things get into the tissues that end up in the seeds, and then it does. And it's a source of increase in genetic diversity over time. And it's these big old trees that were doing the most of this. So, there's at a tree scale. But what about at a forest level? Okay? When we look at a forest, we're looking at more than just what books that one tree has. We're looking at the entire library, the entire diversity for that population. Okay? And so how can we think about this? And for this, I want to talk a little bit about some work that we've been doing in whitebark pine that has kind of opened our eyes to how some of this diversity can be lost or maintained, and how important of a role the big old trees may play. Okay? So this is a forest. It's up in Vipond Park. It's above the Big Hole. It's a high elevation plateau in the, I guess around 2009 to about 2016, there was a big outbreak there, and across a whole lot of whitebark pine across the West. Millions of acres killed by mountain pine beetle. This is kind of unusual because mountain pine beetle doesn't typically get up into the high elevations, but now with warming, it's warm enough and it's gone up and been devastating. These trees are what we call naive. They don't have a lot of experience with the beetle, so they haven't evolved a lot in the way of defenses, so they go down really easy. And so after this whole thing kind of went through and the beetle collapsed, I was walking around in the woods going, now what do I do? The beetles are gone, the trees are dead. And of course, one thing that stood out to me was that there were still some of these big trees remaining. Okay? So at this site, there's about 5% of the big old trees that made it through the outbreak. And I thought that was pretty spectacular because when the beetles were really high in population, they were running out of places to go. They were running out of food, but they didn't go into those trees. And so I'm thinking, I wonder if they're genetically different. There's something about these trees the beetles don't like. And if it is genetically based, that's awesome, because that means that these trees, their offspring, may have genes with resistance. They may have those books. So we began to look at these trees in all sorts of ways. I'll talk just mainly the genetics tonight. And I'll walk you through these weird graphs. So these are 3 populations that we looked at. We have 3 more we're looking at right now. The one in the top is Poverty Flat in Idaho. The middle one is that same one I showed you the picture of. That's Vipond Park. And then there's Lacey Creek below that. These are what are called structure analysis, and they're pretty simple to decipher. What you do is you feed in the genetic profiles for all these different trees, and the program clusters those together that are most similar. And then you can go through an analysis to see how many groups you have. So you might get 2 groups, you might get 1 group, you might get 10 groups. In our case, we had 2. So that's why we have 2 colors up there, okay? So what we did is at each of these sites, we looked at the survivors. So those are the ones that are called survivors up there. But we also looked at another group of trees that survived, but they survived mainly because they were too small. Mountain pine beetle likes big trees, and under a certain diameter, there's not enough food under the bark, so they don't attack them. So we looked at these trees that escaped because they were just a little too small. And they were very abundant. And so we thought that if we did the genotypes of those, we could detect probably there would be something like 95% that would be susceptible. They would be different. And then maybe 5% would match up with the survivors. Does that make sense? Okay, so they had to be kind of our proxy for what that population was like before the beetles came. Okay, and so what we found at Poverty Flat was the survivors were definitely very different than those generals or those ones that were slightly small. Okay, and so we think that those ones that are coming out in red are mainly a susceptible type. The green ones are survivors. You can see there's some mixing. At Vipond Park, we had a little more variety, but again, they separate out mainly to survivors or these ones that are probably more susceptible. And then we have Lacey Creek, which we added into the study just mainly because it was really weird. It was the only area out there, this was right near Vipond Park, but it didn't get beetles. And the trees were the same diameter. And there was same elevation. We couldn't figure out what's the difference. So we wanted to see. Well, they have both, but yet the beetles didn't attack any trees there. So we looked at some of the other things that we had been looking at, and one of them was growth rate. It turned out that these trees at Lacey Creek were extremely slow growing. And that's something else that we found was that all these sites, the slow-growing whitebark pines were the ones that survived. Those ones that made it were not only genetically different, they were slow. The fast-growing trees are what the beetles went after. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But this Lacey Creek site, even though those trees were the same size, they were more than twice as old. They were really, really slow. They were very old trees. And something nice about growth rate is it's also genetically based. And so if this is related to resistance, it's something that can be passed on. Okay. Oh, I forgot something really important here. And one thing we found was that the younger trees also had lower genetic diversity. And this completely surprised us. It's completely opposite of what we expected. So with the big old trees, there was about 5% left. We expected those trees to have low genetic diversity because most of them had been killed. And just by chance, you would expect most of that genetic diversity, a lot of those books would have been lost, right? What we found was they had really high genetic diversity. And this really abundant number of these smaller trees was really low. And we're like, that is so weird. What is going on? And so we had to really think about it. And this is what we think is happening. And this is completely made up. It's just an example. Because this is just an idea we're looking at. Okay? So on the top, you have that straight line across between the dark and the yellow, dark green and the yellow bars is average precipitation. It's the way you can look at that. The dark green bars above the line are wetter than normal years, and the yellow bars below it are drought years, okay? And so what we think is happening is that as trees begin to germinate and begin to grow, they are having to be able to grow under the conditions when they're germinating. And those conditions vary over time. And so I'll try and do this on both sides, but if you look here, let's say that these young trees here, they're having to germinate under a period of drought. And so you would expect that the trees that survive during this period as little young seedlings are ones that can take hot, dry conditions and survive. Those that need wet, cool conditions are probably killed. Okay? Now over here, it's kind of moderate. It's up and down. You would expect maybe the full range of genetic variation can tolerate that because it's not extreme drought or extreme wet. Over here is a wetter period, and you would expect the trees that are adapted and have the books, the genes for wet and cool are going to do the best, and maybe those that like it hot and dry are going to die. And so you're going to have selection for different genes, and certain ones will drop out, and that's going to lower diversity, but not always in the same way through time, okay? Over here you've got this extended drought. You're probably going to have extremely drought-tolerant seedlings. And that just means that your diversity in those forests is going to go up and down. And if you have really harsh conditions under which these seedlings are coming up under, you're going to lose more diversity at those times because only some will have what it takes. We think that might be what's happening. So what might this all mean? Well, in our forests and also in some other studies that people have done, not in all cases, but most cases, the older trees and old growth forests in particular have greater genetic diversity. So they're valuable. They are a bigger library. These younger cohorts that come in may vary in the genetic diversity they have. So at first when we saw that some of these young trees had low diversity, we got really freaked out because we thought, my God, we're moving into a period where they need a lot of diversity to deal with all this change, and they're losing it. But it may be that if you have a forest with this kind of a structure, you have these big old trees that they're continuing to produce seeds that have that diversity. They're producing pollen that is mixing with these other cohorts that have lower diversity. And so they're increasing the diversity in those low diversity trees because they're mixing with them to produce seeds. And so when you have all of this together, you have a couple of things going on. You're maintaining diversity, but you're also allowing some trees to be adapted to different conditions so that as things change, you are able to have trees that are able to deal with that change. So like right now, we want trees that can handle warmer, drier conditions. And this allows us to maintain that diversity. What happens if you lose those old trees? If they're your reservoir of your diversity, the biggest part of your toolkit, that may be a very bad thing. So it might be really important, especially at this time, to hang on to those big old trees the best we can. Okay. I did mention that the survivors were slower growing, and growth rate turns out to be genetically based. So it may be that this is a trait they can pass on, and maybe it helps resistance. Now the beetles are pretty much up in whitebark pine to stay because it's warm. I don't know how many people have ever taken a tree core. Anybody? Yes, yes. It's cool, huh? It is so, it's like addicting. Because every time you take a core out of a tree, it's like pulling its autobiography out. You can see that tree's entire life. You can see the bad times, you can see the good times, and you can see what it is that tree liked or didn't. Because trees are different. They don't all have the same things they like in life. Okay? So if you look at a tree core, you have all these rings. The wider they are, the better that tree's doing. Life is good. If it's really skinny, it's really struggling. And each of those rings, because it's a year in the tree's life, we can figure out what year it was, and we can compare that to climate data, and we can see if it likes it wet, if it likes it dry, all sorts of things, how snowpack affects it, humidity, all sorts of stuff, spring, winter, fall, all these different climate variables to see what is affecting growth in that tree. And we can use that information to look to see what trees are most likely to be hit by the beetles. We can look at it to see what their potential ability to survive in a hotter, drier environment is. And so there's a lot we can do with this. And like I said, we found these trees that were surviving the beetles were slower. And we don't know exactly why that is, but we do know slower growing trees demand a whole lot less water. And so maybe in these drier times, they're not stressing as much and the beetles are not going after them. But we don't know yet. Okay, sorry about this heading, but size does matter. Small remnants of old growth are at massive risk. Okay. It's obvious that they're at risk of disturbance because if they're small, the likelihood they get wiped out and one is huge, whereas if they're big, maybe you're only going to lose some. But as you reduce the number of trees, you are going to lose genetic diversity as you lose individuals, okay? Because it's really the whole big population that contains the whole library. And if you start losing individuals, you're losing part of your books, okay? Small, like I mentioned, creates what we call genetic bottlenecks and drift. You just, by random, can lose a lot of your diversity just by losing some individuals. Connectivity matters, okay? We hear about wildlife corridors all the time, you know, that we need to have places where deer can move, antelope, grizzly bears, between populations. And I think we do a really terrible job of explaining why that's important. I think a lot of people think, oh, and animals used to move around a lot. It'd be nice if they could still do it. Probably true, but that's not why we're so worried about corridors. It's gene flow, okay? So if you have isolated populations of big trees or anything else, those populations are at risk of losing genetic diversity. And so you may have lost some here, you may have lost some here, but if you're connected, individuals can move, pollen can move, and you can refresh that diversity. It's like a big interlibrary loan system. Little libraries may not have everything, but if you've got this interlibrary loan system, you can access all of it. And that's true with our populations too. That's why fragmentation, small populations are all things we worry about a lot. Okay, I must have talked fast because I was so worried about getting here late. So I finished fast, but I hope I've convinced you that old growth is important for a lot of reasons, but perhaps the main one is it is the knowledge and wisdom of that species and that forest. I would like to encourage you to celebrate old growth by experiencing all the stuff that's going on this month here. But even more important, go out there and get in old growth. There's nothing like old growth to hang out in. It's pretty spectacular, and try a lot of different kinds. And support your own local forest library. And the best thing you can do there is to protect old growth. We have very little left. There's no need to actually have to cut any more of it. And so protecting it is like protecting our future forests. Okay. And I did talk too fast, or I forgot something big. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah?
This might be a dumb question, but how many trees actually do they consider to make an old growth forest?
I have no idea. Some people, like, you know, you look at Devoto Grove and some of these other places, there's not much. You know, there's no size that's put on these things.
Like the ones that you drive through and see in a park or along the road. I mean, there might be, 10, 20 trees there. Is that considered a forest?
We call it a stand. You know, there's no general value you put on what size is a forest. But there is a genetic term, which is effective population size. And that means you have to have a certain number of individuals for that to be a viable population. That's very different. And that is not based on the number of trees. It's based on the diversity that's within that population. But most of our old growth is fairly small. You know, there are some big areas like in the Yak or the Tongass and stuff like that. But a lot of what we have left are patches that people have seen fit to protect. But there's no definition of what makes a forest, I don't think. Yeah.
A place like Glacier Park, I mean, there hasn't been any logging there, right, for maybe ever. So do we have old growth forests up there?
There is some, and there's a lot that isn't because, you know, it burns. So if you look at the lodgepole pine up there, it burns a lot, and that's natural. And, you know, there's places that, I don't know about in Glacier, but in California I've seen old growth lodgepole. But it's kind of rare because it has to be in circumstances where burns are uncommon. So, but if you go into some areas, I'm trying to think of the name of the lake, but a lot of the kind of north-facing slopes don't burn as much because they're wetter and cooler. They have different types of forests. There's definitely old growth, lots of it. Well, relatively speaking, right? But a lot of Glacier is what we would call a disturbance-type ecosystem. It's meant to burn often. They never reach like really old ages. And that's perfectly natural for some forests. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In mammals, genetic diversity is really important because you can have certain genetic problems evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Does that fit the same way with trees?
Yeah, trees can experience problems with inbreeding as well.
And is there a way to deal with that? I mean, you've got the corridors, but if you don't have corridors, do we as a society have mechanisms to bring in diversity?
Ooh, you're getting into dangerous territory here. There's a couple of camps. One is that we know that forests are locally adapted, okay? They adapt to the conditions where they're at. And so they have kind of a different set of genes that have been selected for over time that make them function well there. A ways over, that forest will be locally adapted to something else. And it may be that an area may lose a lot of genetic diversity, and some people say, well, you just go somewhere else, get some diversity, and bring it in. The problem is you can create something else called genetic pollution, which is where you introduce locally adapted traits from somewhere else that are maladaptive for the new place. And they can actually reduce the ability of those trees to do well. And they can also, if you bring in too much, it does what's called genetic swamping, where those traits take over and you lose your local adaptation here. So moving around diversity, genetic diversity, is a very dangerous thing, but it's something a lot of people are wanting to do now with climate change. So we want to move warm adapted, dry adapted trees to places to take over because we're worried about losing the trees in those places because they can't handle it anymore. And I think it's a dangerous can of worms. It's best to try and work with what you have on site. Something I hadn't mentioned, which I meant to, is that conifers like pines and Doug fir and larch and sequoias have some of the highest genetic diversity of anything on the planet. Like 9 times higher diversity than we do. They are really diverse. They have these huge genomes, some of it's repeats, but they have huge genomes. That's why it's so hard to work with their genetics, it's complicated. But they have huge toolkits. And we don't take advantage of that very much. Most people working with trees don't recognize the genetic aspects. And yet, here's the tools, right? A lot of these forest stands that we are worried about losing probably have some of the genetics they need to be able to survive into a changing future. But people are worried about losing them, so they want to bring things in.
Has it been done?
Oh, people are doing it already, yeah. And there's this thing called assisted migration, which is part of it, which I think is a very scary thing. But that's just me. There's a lot of people that think it's the way to go. So, yep, Vlad?
How do we protect our old growth from threats that they may be?
The question was, how do we protect old growth forests from threats that they may be naive to? And most of those threats are like exotic organisms and things. And I think the best thing we can do is to try to keep exotic organisms out. The problem is we're extremely bad at that. And that's why we're losing so many forest ecosystems to exotic pests, is that we import so much stuff with no regulation, or it's not enforced because it's economically, it's good economically, and so the protection of the forests is sort of secondary. I think the only way we can really protect not just old growth, but our forests in general is to get really strict with wood imports, but that's pretty unlikely with the economic situation. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've been attending some of these meetings for the forest plan revision, the local forest plan revision, some of them right here. And you mentioned something about the size of the stands matters. You said small remnants are at a massive risk. The conversation about old growth comes up at these, tables. I don't want to call them collaborative tables because they're more just talks. There's no discussion, no decisions coming out of it. But I can hear what people are saying, and the forest personnel and staff and leadership seems to think that they can manage to reduce the risks of this, these remnants, whatever remnants remain, and the tool that they have in their toolbox is a chainsaw.
Yeah.
What do you think about, can logging protect these remnants?
I personally think it's the opposite. I think they should be completely left alone.
People should be aware that that's coming down the pike when they have a chance to comment.
It's constantly coming down.
Yeah, I mean, you can hear it old growth, like it's like, it's like, well, we have to go into old growth to protect it, It's like, really, you go into old growth only to take the big, the best trees of what's left.
Yeah.
And I had some other questions, but while you were talking, like, for some reason I expected something about survival of the fittest. And there was, I really didn't hear anything about that, that talked about the dependence on the conditions and.
Yeah. The survival of the fittest is a tough one. It's not a real concept, sort of. It depends how you define fitness. We always see it as one trait. It's like it can take that and survive. Trees are old. They are out there a long time. And so they have to be able to survive a lot of different things. And it's surviving many, many, many things over many times over the lifespan that contributes to their fitness. And as an ecologist, the fitness is how much of your DNA and genome you pass on and survival, okay? And so it gets murky when you look at more than one trait, right? We think of somebody, the survival of the fittest, you fight it out, and the toughest one makes it. But the thing is with nature, some of the things that don't look really fit or really strong, like slow-growing trees, may actually be the ones that are most fit and most likely to survive. In Arizona, they found these gnarly old pinions that looked like crap. They hardly grew. They were cutting them out because they thought they were weak and wimpy. They were the ones that were making it through the droughts. They were making it through the moth outbreaks. They were the fittest, but they didn't fit the forester's idea of this vigorous, fast-growing tree. But that's not nature. Nature was saying these are the ones that can get through it. So fitness is this thing that has many components to it. And the longer live something it is, the more it has to deal with many things, and that fitness is going to be affected by so many things. That's why the genetic diversity is so important, is we can't predict what is going to make a tree fit, right? It needs all these different tools. So, okay, wow, it's slower growing. That's what we're going to breed for. That's what we're going to replant. Well, that's dangerous because trees have to do a lot of other stuff than just deal with beetles. So letting nature mix and then natural selection remove those that can't take it, because we don't know who those are, right, is going to be the best thing. I mean, that's how nature's always done it, right? So that's what, I've been trying to get some of the genetic stuff into some of the ways we go into forests. When we go in, we act like all the trees are clones. They're genetically identical. What matters is what species they are, how big, how many, how far apart they are. And that's how we manage. We cut to fit a prescription of spacing and size, as if they're clones. They're all genetically identical. We're cutting blind because we don't really know what we're taking out. We could be taking out the ones that forest needs. We don't know. Okay? We're not actually addressing the most important thing about those trees. That's their library. Just my view. Yeah.
One thing I didn't hear anything about was like underground connections amongst the trees through the root systems. Is that a thing they talk about these days?
It's a thing, but we don't know how big of a thing. So there was a book and some studies that came out a while back about the mother tree and learning about all the connections and signaling. And her work is really good. But I think it's been, both in her book and in the press, kind of overblown as to what is really happening. There's other studies now that are trying to tone it down a little. These mycorrhizal fungi that grow with the roots of the trees are crucial. Most of our trees can't survive without them. All of our trees around here, except alder and a couple others, have them and have to. But they also don't just grow with their tree. They connect to the next tree. They connect to other trees of other species. And fungi are interesting. I love fungi. I work on them. They signal. And they can send signals along long distances. They don't have cell walls. They're almost like one big cell sharing stuff. And so if they need nutrients down here, they'll send it from a good place to a bad place. If there's something happening down here that there's toxins, they'll send a signal back this way. And what happens is that gets passed between trees as well. But nobody knows quite how important it is for the forest to be connected that way. Some of the work she did showed that these big clear cuts where the connections are split up and they don't remain, the trees don't do as well. And that's been seen before. So there's probably something to this need for connectivity below ground, not just above ground. But I think that's an area that needs a lot more study as to really what's going on. I think it's important, but I don't really understand what it's doing.
Do those fungi then share any of their DNA with the tree?
Not that I know of, but I don't know how many people have looked. I imagine people have looked. They've been studying those for some time. Yeah. I don't know if they're being in exchange with those, though. Yes?
So for instance, if a forest has, like, a lot of the trees have been pretty significantly affected with beetle, we would want to maybe not harvest those trees because...
The leftovers, the survivors?
Well, yeah, but I mean, how do we know? I mean, how long does it take before we know if they're survivors?
Well, when you have an outbreak, you know which ones are. And one of the things I've recommended is that in places where they go in and salvage, because this has also been sort of seen with lodgepole where they do harvest, is that the practice is typically you take out the green trees with the dead because they get a higher price at the mill and it helps pay for that salvage cut because salvage cuts cost money. They don't make money. So if you want it to break even or make some money, you take the green with it. That's just standard practice. But then you're removing the trees that might have an adaptation to the beetles and maybe even adaptation to drought if they're slower growing, which we need. And so if there can be a way to keep the survivors on the landscape, and if you're going to do salvage, not to take those. It'll be a hard sell because of economics. And people don't think of future forests much, but that would be more ideal.
I'm going to go back to an example from, like, the flathead has this sale or project called the Mid-Swan. And one of their proposals was to bring in whitebark pine.
Yeah, assisted migration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what it's called, like assisted migration.
Is it, are they restoring whitebark where they lost it, or is it bringing it into a new place?
I think that, no, there wouldn't, I think that there's already some existing there, but.
It's probably restoration because that's a wet area.
This is in wilderness.
Oh, yeah. I don't agree with that at all, but that's my personal opinion. Wilderness we need to keep our hands off of, I think. But that's one of the things with the loss of whitebark pine. People are pushing really hard to take blister rust resistant seedlings into wilderness. And I think that's a big mistake. Because like I said, it's the only place we have left where we can see what would happen with nature. Will there be natural selection? When you bring in seedlings, they're not adapted to the conditions that, oh, that's not my graph anymore, but they have been grown in a nursery. They have not been adapted for new conditions, climate change. So they are not going natural selection. They're going to be pampered and then put out there. We don't.
They have a genetic, from seedlings, they have a genetic makeup that came from, we don't know where.
Well, they typically try to collect them from areas where they're going to plant. Unless there is not much left, then they have to collect from somewhere nearby. And so you are moving stuff around. But most of the time with the blister rust resistant seedlings, they're planted back from seeds they've tried to collect in that same location. But they're not going to undergo the adaptation of a seedling due to climate change. They're going to be grown in a nursery and put out. And that's fine. I mean, in some places that tree's almost gone, and it's the only hope there is to bring it back. But in wilderness, there's a place where there's a potential for natural selection to occur, and I think we should try to, once you open up that door to managing wilderness, it's not just going to be whitebark pine, it's going to be everything.
Are there, you know how they saved libraries of different types of seeds, you know? Do they do that with like the old growth, you know?
There's a lot of people doing seed libraries with older trees.
I mean, to just save them for in perpetuity. So.
Yeah, but I mean, you can't put them back out, really, because you've lost the mycorrhizae, everything that is specific to an old growth forest floor. They're not going to be the same, and they may not grow the same, or they may not grow. So this idea we can just bank things and then it's okay because we could put them out again later, you know, you can't rebuild an old growth forest because it's more than just trees. It's all the other stuff that depends on them and that web that forms over such long period of continuity. So yeah, you have the trees and it's better than nothing, you have the seeds, but the best thing is just not to lose it.
Unless they dig the soil up too, you know, take soil from the same location.
But it'll change. Once you get new growth in or something, they nitrify it, it changes. Soil changes and then it doesn't support the same forest. So it's not so easy. Ecosystems are built not, you know, by nature. We can't really do that. Mm-hmm.
I think that's our biggest challenge is human, or not human, but our society trying to control things that we start realizing the complexity, but when does it trickle down to economics, politics?
Yeah. And humans just always feel like they can fix everything. We can't. So it's best not to break it. All right. Anything else? Yeah.
So, in the old growth conversation, there's a lot of conversation about the big trees of the Northwest, but there are these arid forests in the Southwest, like the PJ woodlands and various others, and those are sort of getting brought now into the conversation around old growth, and I'm wondering, it seems looks like there's not that much literature about the characteristics, traits, and conditions of those old growth, or even what makes it.
Yeah, I mean, we can't define it very easily, and it has to be system specific. But those pinyon ones are a great example because they're not giant sequoias and all that stuff. People don't think about those trees they're driving through, those junipers and pinyons and stuff, as old growth, and they can be just as old. And they have very special characteristics. And no, they're just as important. Some of those are crucial, but we don't know as much about them that way. Yeah.
I have one more question. At the beginning, I was taking notes, and you described like no single definition of old growth forest. The forester had one definition, people believe another. But then you said something about how ecologists best define old growth, and I missed that.
Well, it's very similar. It's just that we're thinking more not just a progression and you get to a point, but it's an area of quite low disturbance for a long period. And that's really crucial, because if you have disturbance, you're not going to have old growth, because you keep getting the clock reset to younger growth. Okay. And I don't mean to say that everything should be allowed to go to old growth. Some forests are never meant to ever even reach that stage because they're disturbance dependent. Okay. We live in a place where we can understand that, I think. But yeah, but it is system dependent. And okay. Well, thanks everybody. And sorry if I talked really fast. I must have.